So, questions?
제가 맨날 캠을 가장 앉아 지도라. 가장 앉아 당부 들어내 들라 아니 이게 가르송도서나 그런게 군두잖아요. 아니 주인도 받을 수있어는 그런 저거도 쓰다사. 다다니 싫어 거라이나 하고 말이라. 맞아 대식 간투드로 제르때 싫어 스타다리나 하고 무슨 테네 대치 아니데 마음이 시스테나 아니냐. 미 시바치도 디 갈라나 그런 로 그양보다 아니 둥이라트 Depending on the dinner, she nearing Chatan to Pango and Nara. Look, who young Bolana, Chatan getting there. Zandan Chikangi Chinji ten lumps up Chigi Chemburu and Zendejo. Kangi Chinji ten that the Nidri Ursa, Kangi Kandito and I did you see the Tangatana, the Indela Kelana, Chixosu, that's Sujang Hamagere, something like Rashima, Lodi Kuyang Bacheda, Ra. 파쇼 미디는 저거는 배 춘주진의 전 춘주진 되게 소소를 강에 마티다. 때 강에 춘주지 때나디 캐마를 가나 째어 한번 레르 사면다. 나는 나라 디파타르 사면다. 근데 지당이 지우 괜찮은 거던데 코알라 데자. 근데 만디버테 중그레 삼나 라시기 때 쿠양 못차이다. 라. 코란데레 레그 아니 로 쿠양 못차야다. 근데 시에치는 데 인라다. 아니 둥이 라트엘라 땅도 가서 주의 둥이 쳐반데 지기 둥이 송 안전더라. 내가 가르치시에 레삼도.
So if there are no questions, then I will try to address some of the expectations that we shared at the start of the course. So one of us talked about how they received a teaching on in praise of the Dharmadhatu from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but at that point it wasn't really a teaching. It wasn't really a teaching when they received a teaching on in praise of the Dharmadhatu from His Holiness. How they shared that it wasn't really an extensive teaching. It was almost like an oral instruction. But now, even as we spend some days exploring in praise of the Dharmadhatu, I am not 100% confident that we were able to kind of discuss it extensively as you expected to. But with that being said, it is important to continue to study this, continue to explore commentaries on this. Then moving on, one of us talked about how they hoped to be more open-minded, and to be able to recognize and accept suffering as it is through their spiritual practice. Now, when we are talking about being open-minded, it is important, I think, to understand that being open-minded means being accepting and being accommodating. And more particularly, being accommodating of all the possibilities, being accepting of the nature of suffering itself. Because if we are not really open-minded, then small problems, small external conditions turn into great source of suffering for us. For example, our reactions kind of compound that sense of suffering. For example, as we discussed before, if we always blame something apart from ourselves for our suffering, then that compounds that sense of suffering. So, as opposed to that, it is important to be accommodating and accepting if we are to become truly open-minded. So, one of those ways is to reflect on the law of causality, karma itself, how nothing is really accidental, how everything comes about due to causes and conditions. And if we are able to reflect on this, then we begin to understand that our own suffering in this life is not accidental, that our own suffering in this life comes from karma that we have accumulated in a previous life. And then, from one perspective, it is also helpful maybe to reflect on the nature of samsara itself, to accept the fact that we are bound in samsara at this point. And as such, our existence will be marked by suffering and problems at times. And then, now with regards to being accepting and recognizing suffering through spiritual practice, we can begin to reflect back on our discussions about the 3 types of suffering and try to recognize them in our own lived experience.
Pendo meba inza ani dile anja digi sanu tan ani semba kusto zogue zona kare pendo yomar di zona che yomar masane ya res kesi di ani nedan joa tanga yejuchi ra pa zoje ja yejuchi na pa zoje ja shene digida digala ani sana yanda de anta semba kusto ani tane zogue yomar ala di mune nga zo nedan kare ina ra ki na cha chuna re chi tamani be tonje manzam ba ji min na la chuba sho da kare ina 내가 마음이 중구라. mình 내가 들 다운도 거치야 예지진이 제셔그래 들은 그 센터 최고야. 다 계속 줘야 매워지 미로 통화된데 다 쓸어요 요마라. 들 센터 전에 편도 요마라. 아 근데 인디 갈랑 아주 근데 지금 치디 빼편도 편도도 한 거도인 라. this sometimes
So with this kind of dilemma we face, it is important, I think, and really helpful to reflect on this particular instruction from the Master Shantideva, when he begins to say that if something can be remedied, why worry about it? If something cannot be remedied, then why worry about it? Remedied, changed, helped. If something can be remedied, why worry about it? If something can't be remedied, then why worry about it? So this, I think, is important to reflect on in our lives. Because if you really think about this instruction, it can help us to face any kind of challenges in our lives better. And it's about the mental outlook. It's about the attitude one cultivates in the face of challenges. So, for example, in your lives, if you face setbacks and challenges, rather than holding on to a sense of being helpless, it is important to dedicate our efforts and energies towards working for a solution, to see if there is a solution. That's more effective. Now, as opposed to that, if there is no solution conceivable at all, then it is pointless to kind of keep worrying about it. It's better to accept that this cannot be helped any further. For example, death and so forth. You cannot expect all your worrying to bring someone back from death. It's better to accept it. So this is what Shantideva means when he says, if something can't be remedied, why worry about it? If something can be remedied, why worry about it?
지단게 semba kusuto mayo chikde khalana ranjiniga chipata ra tige pependoda ko ngani inje chipare dedu dewa mende ba dunge mende ba dewa de ba chichung re sani ge tende lo sama yoina ra ani milen ji tonjuda nya chuda tende chega do mara 제가 먼저도 쓰는데 봐요 말에 라시기 셈발 흘려다 지 신장보다 그 양부 책이라 봐 다랑도 고주전 아마도 아니 스강라야 아니 치칼로 대화도 오면 같이 뿌리는 디 섬데 되게 산 구수 도도나 땅아이나 아니 라시기 직 수수 치부 랑스 때즈 만디와나 아니 지 도미 개장 차대로 근데 아니 라시기 그 구수도 차용다 근데 그냥 셈바 그 양부 책입니다 봐 간지 간주기 인지도 커먼센스 라고말 시장에 진행을 산나 땅에로죠. 몇 상만라다 지바레 지송레 산 산다투나 엔테지 칼로 셈바라시 구양 무차이다.
So we can become accommodating and accepting in our lives if we really are able to accept our shared humanity. When I say that if we learn to accept our shared humanity, then we can become more open, more accommodating, more accepting. I mean, if we are able to work with the acceptance that all of us are at our core, similar and common in the experiences that we want happiness, we don't want suffering. So if we are able to kind of work with that kind of acceptance in our relations and interactions with others, then our experiences and our mental outlook does not become so constricted and narrow. Now, as opposed to that, If we only think about our own selfish concerns all the time, then that kind of attitude in itself is very constricting and narrow. And as such, it also dictates the reaction, our reaction. For example, the slightest of inconveniences begins to feel like a big burden to us, something we must overcome, something we cannot ever accept as happening to ourselves, and so forth. So as opposed to that, it is important maybe to develop that common sense, to appreciate the shared humanity, that the experience of suffering, the experience of inconvenience, problems is not a unique experience only to yourself, that everybody really goes through it. And if you're able to accept this, then you do not become so bothered, constricted, narrow-minded.
아니 베베기 땅배로 다네 뭐 코디가 아니 가오다 다네 중을서네 룬을 다네 고야게 레와치 예르 다네 가장디 간서 돈이 되나로 이게 둥도다 땅배로 싫으시면 시당기 베베기 땅배 망부지라 녀마빨라 아마도 망불라이 얘네 드리 간서 고야랜 시기미라 다 찔리에 친구 차례 산다라 디즈를 고주슈다 라 카베드도 베 간서 페나 엔데르슬레 옌라 뜨데 랑쮸라죠 신 심이 심발라 퍼따네 아니 심바지기 만디버 지기에나 ngati chiju mindulane soso sojeja ndibaji chigena ngati chigudulane soso sojeja jira kona chigula jenla tede ane rang sojeja tzupe khoyadara.
Then moving on, one of us talked about how they, having attended previous classes in the past, introductory classes in the past, then they expected a lot of stories and a lot of Tibetan sayings and proverbs. Now, within our own discussion on the text, maybe we didn't really hear a lot of Tibetan proverbs and sayings. Now, with that being said, when we look at this kind of sayings and proverbs that we find in our own cultures, passed from generation to generation, then there is a lot of wisdom in these sayings. When, for example, in our Tibetan society, the elders, they are full of this kind of sayings. And when we were young, we failed to kind of appreciate the wisdom in these sayings and proverbs. But now, as we grow up to be adults ourselves, then we begin to appreciate the wisdom in these sayings. For example, now there is another saying in Tibetan which says that taking others as an example, begin to transform yourself. So what this saying means is that if someone else is engaging in something negative, then take them as an example for you to not to engage in the same act. Then similarly, if someone is engaging in something positive, meaningful, then take that as an example for you to find the courage and the motivation to do something good too. Mila tawe miyu jan rangla tawe melongwe.
Desu pe khojida. Nganzu zamzu pa zugu chan tsul tayi mara. Ti rawa da ni chang shina la. Ti kunzu la pen thogo da ra zamzu.
So it is tough to remember everything off the top, but maybe this is something related to what we are discussing so far, wherein when we always look to blame someone apart from ourselves for our misery and suffering. For example, in Tibetan we have a saying that you have eyes to see the mistakes and faults of others, but you also need a mirror to see yourself. Are you able to get the meaning?
Yeah, you always look at others' mistakes, you know?
Yes.
You can see them easily, but your own errors are non-existent.
Yes. Because we are kind of helpless with the eyes that we have. It's always projected outside. So as such, it is important maybe to reflect inwards. So when we were young, we kind of failed to appreciate and relate to this kind of things. But now when you think about it, it's very layered and it's full of wisdom when we think about it. It talks about that kind of tendency, that kind of natural reaction we have towards challenges and setbacks that we face, wherein we always blame something apart from ourselves for the situations that we find in ourselves in. And then as opposed to that, it is important, what this saying is advising us is to overcome not only the manner in which we always look outside, but also to overcome the prejudice we have to always blame something apart from ourselves. Should have tremendous.
Okay, then korangi dende do share gita. Rewa yula dada ang sanina inu mandora. Ani ten la shura. Tiji michi kala na ane korangi migi thongya dance. Remo ane korangi chiki namdi loje chena de remo da ane parido dende kana ane shen yapo yosara. Ane ngezang chozi kan dende pesha de kola pento shung sons. Tila tuwan kimdora. Te wala karasana the same like the car ngasrele. You know how much threatening there are. Ngasrele the so shuji ti tatani do jirangi ngarang ngasrele da yan zamzang azu ngasrele on the gala nyegi chikle ka notu kar chige na ti hakwa ra ngasre nge ti kharjin chigola de gala nga zamtane yabuda ra ani nge ti kharjin chigora la digala ani so kali kali tachi ro chine goba ke me ba thona ani chawang yamba da mazang yala phan tosara so ngazaji tanira.
So now, moving on, one of us talked about how they learn better visually. And now in our discussion about emptiness, we try to offer some sort of visual representation of the analysis, wherein we talked about pen, table, and so forth. Maybe if you look at the sevenfold analysis of the chariot, that would be a helpful way to try to visually encapsulate the analysis of emptiness, wherein you look at something like a chariot and its part, and then there is an analysis of whether the parts are the chariot or the collection of the parts are the chariot. So if you use that in your meditation, then maybe that's a visual aid that you can use to reflect on emptiness.
How did they do it in Tibet then?
Huh?
How did they do that in Tibet?
가산 싱다 별로 통하여 말해라라. 아니 별로 아니 곰 간조기 싱다 타드면은 싱다를 제발해야 되다. 그런 리모트 오근에 아니 야가 싱게는 싱다 타드면은 제발텔라 삼마땅나 동니고로 곰자나 디 편보여라라.
디 별로 얘기 통만이라라. 지난 별로 유지래.
요.
사정 아주 사실 구조질을 되더라. 구조질을 이제 구조질데 안 합도 잘해라. 얘 나랑 통말라면 지난 별로데 여행 버리. 가서나 모터 디디 모터 배우면 따다 신다다. 응이 신바 망부 통유 야라 신가 뭐야도 다 대상 내가 통하면 좀 망부지. 야. 근데 지난게 별로면 나랑 통만이야.
So when I say that that was from my own experience, because I come from a very, very remote area, a secluded area. So I immediately came from that remote area to India. But in Tibet, you can find chariots, carts, and so forth in other areas. 대다스 초블랑하시던데.
야보대 잠자들이 거시라. 별에 말이 얘기 만나나 별에 비차 말아줘. 따스다야다.
But this is helpful. In debate, this argument wouldn't have held up at all. Because just because I didn't see it, it doesn't entail, doesn't necessarily follow that it doesn't exist.
디디디간도 되어야다. 저랑 거지. 마통알라 메바메스라. 아니 짱하마데 레진데 미기 통해요 말데 요레스. 라 딩간도 짱하지 버스 두는데가 단로리네 칸지를 시기다. 마통알라 메바메스. 마통아이나 수수 마통아르면 메바 말스. 메바 통해 말라죠.
Now, this, even though you stated in jest, is an important point that is raised in logic and debate, that it doesn't necessarily follow that whatever is not perceived is non-existent. Yes.
그거다 마통하다 매바 통발라지라. 마통할라디 유에나야 수수 통을 말았어. 매버 통할라디 갈래 자원이니 매바치 매비사 통 대시 집어다라.
So there is a sort of a technical distinction that is made between the manner in which you frame something, the words themselves. So for example, it doesn't necessarily follow that whatever you don't perceive does not exist. Then similarly, whatever matongwa meba.
마통와라 매바메. 마통와 쌈지기 매바요마. 이미 잡아요 말했으라. 매바 통바다 마통와니를 쳐봐라. 마드발라 지요는 게 마통와요 저래. 대삼님래 짜와니네 매바에나. 또 짜와니 매바데 하고는 매바 통하라. 이는 얘기 유에나야 마통와들이라. 어디네로.
So now this maybe is an important distinction if you really argue in debate the manner in which you frame non-existence. For example, there is a perception of non-existence of something. Yes, something does not exist in Thosamling. You do not see that which should be there, but you see its non-existence. Then similarly, as we already discussed, just because you don't perceive something does not necessarily mean it does not exist. So non-existence and appearance of perception of non-perception of something as equating it with non-existence. Bejishanas.
배낭에서 째왕하시야. 째왕하 요라지나게 여보 맞아 그 텐데니 요래 이내 가서 통합니다. 라 예버는 마통.
For example, now the most simple example will be rebirth, past and future lives. Just because you don't perceive it doesn't mean it does not exist.
Non-existent example would be
펜션은 가서 얘들에게 딱 그거야. 펜 사제질에 가르스나 근데 리도 딜라 가서 딜디라. 사심바질라 디파룰레 티스지 시나로도 딜리 쳐여바체. 파슈 딜라 도와요 통하나. 라. 내가 저기 매 통요 말에. 이네 두지리 가서는 대대는 다와도 대세기 시디 치신. 아니 매유데 도와요 베시라. 도와요 베 진세시네 매유래는 따고 보라. 진짜. 라. 다이네 저기 매도 여바 두고르데 매여바 통요 말고. 라. 매여바 통요 말데 매바야 통요 말데. 다 딘데기 강사질라 안도 매여다스 칸스나 파이길라 도와도와는 매여바 두고.
So now, for example, this comes from science and reasoning, and what exactly is a correct sign, what exactly is a correct form of reasoning. So, for example, when we talk about not perceiving something and not perceiving something to exist and perceiving its non-existence. For example, you look across a mountain pass, and then you see smoke coming from the mountain pass. Now that's a sign. The smoke is a sign. But the fire you don't see, right? But based on the sign, you begin to infer that there is fire. Now, have you perceived that there is a fire or there is no fire? You haven't perceived that there is fire or there is no fire. But you inferred. You inferred that there is fire.
infer on completion.
Yes. Di jibat samaras.
기바타 말이야. 나 단데 태산도 전도 디잡로 버더면 디 자디도 통해 말아. 다 알아. 태산들라 자디에 파이케 잡에실라나. 남디 디끼 자디 끼 뭐 하거나 알다 걸 자디 딜 자디 요서래 파이케 잡들라. 먼저 진세를 때네. 기바.
So similarly, I don't know how many of you do realize this, but in Thosamling we have, is it cocks or is it hens? Chickens. So we have chickens, let's say. But if you haven't seen this, then you can begin to infer that there is chicken in Thosamling because you hear them crowing.
그거도 저 같이 통하지 말아.
Have you heard the chickens? No?
Yeah, in the morning.
In the morning.
See? Not see. 통화마라.
통영만.
아, 세상에
Negative phenomena?
다 거의 딜라게 안저기 각줍래 줘라. 각추도 줍출래. 다디 각추로 왔어. 단다티.
예버 두다.
No, that's not a negative phenomenon. A
That's a-
negative phenomenon
yeah, but the word
negates something. This doesn't negate something. This affirms the existence of.
Yeah, so what is a negative phenomenon?
Negative phenomena is something that negates.
메텔라네 도라. 요마르라네. 라.
So, for example, as opposed to saying that there is fire because of the smoke, there is no fire because there is no smoke.
베나디 테삼리라 야 메테. 수강기 자마토에 실라라. 라, 야 메비 준세 카르라나. 단다보도 미스치기 통요마라. 그래서 연치 통고라 고짜사 오라 징도 오라. 수강 통요마라. 라. 데데로지라 메바두.
So, a negative phenomena is in effect a negative statement. There is no yak in Thosamling. Because nobody's seen a yak in all these ages in Thosamling.
And this yak is existent or non-existent?
Yak in itself is existent, but there is no yak in Thosamling.
Yeah, this dile dile mundula chita mebala umada.
It's not a general statement as to say there is no yak in this world. There is no yak in Thosamling.
chita dagi chate yobade thosamnila yobadura. Chita yobodu mare. Thosamnila yobodude. Thosamnila yede degaranga ke koyesile. Tanda dile mede ngaz dile yebi miskan ma thon yesila maji. Chita ya mebadu ma.
So this is important to distinguish when we are debating that it's the yak as such is not treated as a generality here. The yak is treated as a particular instance of yak in Thosamling.
Katari gardoja.
Tachida chidala edilente.
Basic questions, and it's okay.
There are always more questions. No? Generality, instance, affirming, non-affirming, negative.
So these are just like, just to understand the context, these are all ways in which we misperceive. So then we understand what is true cognition and non-cognition.
That dinalani nganzo thanda thuduche de di chama nganzo gi ni lo khande thudugyo lo tsemala na khande re di dubdan gola shigi yorwas.
chita nganzo pena nganzo ta. Chita ta tanda nganzo chigi yobadu. Pena nganzo maa chagi chi yobadu na tedela jime de thoye bishila duwe chira. Ta meba tenda duwe. Ta khande duzu khari duwe sana nganzo ya inba ya duwe ra. Pena nganzo doji pena pumba chiji matate cheba inbe shiri do lawa na pumba di mataba duwe ra. Pumba mataba duwe ni khari chigola na ti kali randi litsa jane ngaya mataba re basa. 소소 메타바 기지 인지도에 임바 하고 온도가 아니 딘데게 데비리라야 아니 자신 망보지 찌네 먼저 그치 칼라 니리 차다 망보지 전도노지 망보지 싸더라 싫어야 담이도 자 데비 내거도 고르데 간단히 집이 추진 인자 아주 찔레게 와시오지 고야입니다 자 근데 파 되는 바트니 티로
So rather than just simply focusing about the logical entailments itself in debate, it is important that we take that kind of reasoning, take that kind of critical analysis with our own lived experience. That's the purpose of debate, actually. So, for example, in debate, it's not always arguing about what is existent or not. It is also arguing about being. So, for example, right now we talk about whether the fire exists in the mountain pass, looking at a sign such as a smoke. Then similarly, we look at something as being impermanent. For example, the pot is impermanent because it is a product of causes and conditions. So this is the manner in which we try to work with logic, reasoning, and debate. Now, similarly, with this kind of reasoning, we have to be able to now change that reflection onto ourselves, that the self is impermanent. And then the manner in which you relate to something impermanent, and with that kind of logical analysis, one should be able to overcome the sense of attachment, overcome the sense of looking at something impermanent as something permanent.
이만 가서 진주 가라. 디까와당 봄바당 드즈 치지산 mambo 쩌거라. 라. 다디 다니에 갈래 가보다 지겨라 다 봄바라는데 이만 셔라 좀 보고 셔라 하고 말아. 다 கொஞ்சம் දිනට 드즈 카리네 마시네 잘라드즈라. 지금 따바이네 마이는데 카르 펜도이나 로 튕겨. 디장저진 봄바다 가와다 드즈를 치러는 빼고 쓰 드즈 빼션. 예래 참무샤는데 츠빠베르다 된다디 츠꼬라제네. 타마들 수술 쓰자인스라. 먼저 뭐 파츠 아니데 진디마데 코페는 미지 디카와데 따바인라나. 따바마인바데 디니바 차일데 차일 딱한다 이제 마부지고도 파. 치는 안 줄래 리바 세르데. 리바 뭐 땅고라. 미지기데 따바인라나. 얘기 못다바인 뭐 두고라. 두고라 얘기 레바 뭐지 표시 땅 선땅. 못다바인 파이 미디 케만에는 켈레 소고라. 아, 다 못다바인에 간데. 거기서는 어디 딱바르시 가잖아 다가라 두던데 다가라 두 산이에 다가라 요래지 대선 따바르에 나가신 파기 레전디 얘기 말했을 때 집이 주제지는 지야 요래서 그냥게 가전 통 다가나 돼요 말했으라 기지기지 지차랬어 빼나 먼저 준주 보고 다리 째바니 단다봐도 먼저 그 지원 알아서 통마서 친구차 통문다 수 통요 말아 이내야 그냥 제비 유모니 단다봐도 그냥 친구 가지셔야 돼 때 기지 그런 단다 되봐도 레어 레디가라 아니 서로 두고다
So now this is important to understand because when we were young nuns, we failed to kind of appreciate this while we were training in debate and logic. And now in the classical debate, you almost become fed up at one point with the example of pot and pillar. Because that's the classic example that you use to explore impermanence and so forth. So we always are debating either about a pot or a pillar or both at the same time. And at one...
It's also very common. Even with the psychology course, you gave that same example.
So this is a classic example. But when we get fed up with this, we fail to appreciate what exactly is that we are investigating. We are not investigating pot and pillar actually. We are investigating the true nature of pot and pillar. It being impermanent and so forth. So as young nuns, we were training in effectively our capacity to investigate something, to critically analyze something. And it might be the case that another nun obstinately says that pot is permanent. Now it is your task as a debate, not to say that it's impermanent and leave it at that, but to logically prove. The onus is on the debater to logically prove to someone who holds such a position that the pot is indeed impermanent. And then sometimes they obstinately say that the pot or the pillar yesterday appears the same, today it appears the same, so as such it's permanent. But then you have to logically try to prove that such a position is untenable by looking at momentary disintegration of the pot. And we try to cite examples such as look at yourself when you were a child and when look at you right now. You think you never saw that child changing into an adult, but now you've changed into an adult. That shows the momentary nature of phenomena. So in this manner, you begin to try to investigate phenomena's true nature. And that helps you to critically analyze reality itself. So we fail to appreciate that when we were young nuns. We become fed up with pots and pillars. But now, when you think about it, it's just a matter of changing the focus to bring it to the self, experiences, sensations, feelings, emotions, and so forth. There is a funny story in Tibet. So in Tibet, there is this festival called the Great Prayer Festival, Melam Chemo. And during the Great Prayer Festivals, then the geishas take their vows. And as such, there's a lot of debate going around during the Melam Festival. It's a gathering of monks. Thousands and thousands of monks gather. So then it is the case that if you go to Lhasa, the capital of city, at the time of Melam Festival, then you see the monks debating everywhere. Because that's the kind of atmosphere during the Melam Festival. And then there was a nomad, illiterate nomad who was visiting for a pilgrimage And then he saw two monks debating. And then the monks were debating about a golden pot, a clay pot, and they were debating endlessly. And then when he saw how animated they were, almost to the point of, very animated in their gesture, caught up in debate, then he thought, oh, this is a little bit unbecoming of monks, spiritual practitioners, because they should be peaceful, calm, and so forth. But he didn't pay it any mind. But he had that sense of feeling that maybe this is a little bit unbecoming of monks to engage in such a public display of disagreement. And then the next year he came for a pilgrimage again, and he saw the same two monks in the same spot, still arguing about gold pot and clay pot. And at that point, the illiterate Norman couldn't tolerate it anymore, and he said, "You are monks, stop arguing with each other. If you really are worried about a pot, I will give you 2 golden pots each." But the Norman failed to appreciate what exactly are they arguing about, They were arguing about the pot's impermanence, the pot's in emptiness, the isolate of a pot. And that becomes more complicated. The Pumbe Dopa, the Pumbegi, Midapa, Pumbe Tomba, and let's say they are big Hakuma, the Kotoboy, Abotoboy. Now, isolate is the most difficult to explain, difficult to understand. The Doba means in the Aboji Hakuna, the Goroi Hagoda. The woman is Raja Pekaboda. So the Lagaji.
No.
So maybe we try to think about, we say isolates, and we understand there is such a thing called meaning generality first. That the manner in which we relate and perceive a pot is not just only the appearance of the pot itself, but with the appearance of a meaning generality too. So as such, we say that the pot as a functioning thing is impermanent. But the meaning generality of the pot is permanent, because it doesn't momentarily disintegrate. Whereas this is momentarily disintegrating.
Meaning generality would be the idea.
Generic image of the pot. Generic image of the pot. Now with that being said, it is not enough that just a pot appears in the mind for us to effectively say that this is a pot, conceptually, mentally. There is, from the Buddhist perspective, a whole mental process which goes on, wherein the mind begins to differentiate between what is not a pot and not a pot, what is not a pot and what is a pot. And on the basis of negating all that is not a pot, then that meaning generality of what is a pot is established. So the reversal of a non-pot is the isolate of the pot. The reversal, the opposite of a non-pot. So for example, this is a pen, this is a cup. So for the mind to effectively decide that this is a pot, this is a pen, it has to ensure first that what appears is not a pen. Yes? Now, without the pen, the mind has to effectively also decide that when nothing also appears, it has to effectively decide that what appears is a pot by negating all that is not a pot. Non-pot, we call that. What is not a pot? Non-pot. So the reversal of non-pot is the isolate of pot. Yeah, it's difficult to understand. If you understand this, then you have a solid foundation in debate and logic. Yes.
So everything that's non-pot is the isolate.
No, the reversal of the non-pot.
The reversal of the non-pot. What does the reversal mean?
What does isolate mean?
Not non-pot.
Non-pot.
Reversal of
So everything that it negates.
what is not a pot.
What is not a pot? That is the reversal.
Yes, because it is negating all that is not a pot
Yeah.
to say that this is a pot. mentally, conceptually.
Yeah.
Mm.
And that is then an isolate.
Yes, that's the isolate of the pot.
That's the because we can recognize that as
Exactly,
pot.
that's the manner in which the mind characterizes what is a pot.
I see.
That's because the only way in which conceptual thought works is not as sense perception, wherein sense perception doesn't discriminate. It only takes objects as it is, directly. Now, conceptual thought always works negatively. It always eliminates what is not to establish something as something.
So is isolate, is that
It's like
permanent
pieces.
phenomenon?
Hmm?
Is that permanent phenomenon?
Of course, just like the generic image, that isolate is a permanent phenomena. Dogba tagbarada.
The big cover.
It gets more confusing later on. Then rando la.
Pumba taba ma pumba ngora pumba doba taba na pumba doba shola na pumba sha. Tem go proper to do.
Now this gets confusing because the pot as a functioning thing is impermanent, but the isolate of a pot is permanent because it's an image. Image. It's an image.
The definition of isolate, that which isolates everything that is not one with the object.
Now that's a more technical. Then you have to speak about one with and different. Now this gets confusing because it kind of challenges the normal way in which we perceive reality. That's why it gets confusing. So for example, we say that the pod is a functioning thing. The object pod is a functioning thing. But the isolate of the pod is permanent. Now, when you say that the isolate of the pod is permanent, then if you are asked to posit what is the isolate of the pod, then it's nothing other than pod.
It's my image of the pot. So how can that be permanent? Because it's basically this my idea of what makes a pot.
So that's why we look at the definition of definition of impermanent phenomena. The definition of impermanent phenomena, it's momentary, momentarily disintegrating. But that image doesn't momentarily disintegrate. It immediately appears.
And disappears as well.
But that's not momentary. Whenever we think about it, it appears same.
Just the same way. But if you look at it as a phenomena, like an idea, then it also appears and disappears.
Yes, of course.
Yes, of course. But just the way that it appears is the same.
Yes.
Kotsi tane abo esata.
Now you should you should study logic and debate.
Me lanu chitangda. Lebo tin so zuda. Tende tane pe abo singre. Ine ya lamsa sigma de lo mabo kore ya. Lo chin da chin jam de singma. Mune
Tagabo tasentana lenkande jayte tawadambo. Maybe Geshema is saying that it takes a certain kind of mind to truly appreciate logic and debate. And there is so much technicality in the study of logic and debate. So you have to be, in some ways, very detail-oriented in the manner in which you study something. So from what she gathers so far, from your reaction, she thinks that maybe the study of logic and debate might be something you should explore.
Yeah, it seems really exciting. I also enjoy it. But I'm just wondering, where can I start if I'm...
Welcome Institute. That's happening.
If you are really serious, if you are really serious, the best program is in IBD, in Institute of Buddhist Dialectics. But for that, you would have to learn Tibetan.
Yeah, but then you have to go to Sarah College first as well.
Yeah.
So that takes like 4 years. And then you do debate as well.
ale tete ngoda.
9-10 years, at least.
Kesi kan tan lo khadir.
How old are you right now?
I'm 28.
Nishizaji.
He gombal tseye je de ani gomba de ne pechi konzo lo ya chale lo chilung hondo lo me je. Hondo de le sin lo they teach debate in a preparatory class level.
In the preparatory class that you are in, do they teach debate?
Starting with colors and
colors.
That's the perfect place to start.
But very basic. The
Very
little ones. Yeah, I think next year they will
Next
start
year.
in a more advanced way.
Maybe you should look for like programs, 6-month programs, preparatory programs in monasteries and monastic institutes.
Nunnery.
Not just logic and debate, it could be a part of it in these programs.
She could maybe join the Serkan Rinpoche program, right?
Yeah, but the first year is already done with
Yeah.
basic, right? So
They're already quite far along with it.
Okay.
단다 디 세그룹이 따리 치고라.
Tanda duda do desh kunsa. Tari ra, you are studying Tariq, right?
I think she can join.
Yeah, she can catch up, but it will take a lot of work on your own to catch up.
but
You have to.
start now because it starts in October with the second year. There are recordings, so when you ask, you want to participate, you get access to the recordings, but then you really have to start now to catch up everything. It might be possible, yeah.
Okay,
I can give you the contact.
This is the logic and debate course.
this is which is coming in October here,
Yeah.
for 3 months.
Yeah.
But yeah, I saw it, but I saw it's the second year, so
That's was exactly what she was saying.
okay.
Yeah, so when you're really keen into it, you can, and then take a lot of effort to work out the first year by yourself with the recordings,
Okay.
you might catch up.
Okay, is it possible? Like how extensive is
Yeah,
that?
I can provide you with the contacts and then you ask them.
Thank you.
I was also considering it. Yeah, but it's
Nyangyi dread kunsa this. You really are. You really do want to struggle for the next few months. You will struggle, I'm sure.
oh yeah.
Yes.
Which
Oh,
is
it's
like
quite
the
intense.
youngest age kids start to debate, like in the way you.
As young as 6 in the monastic institutions.
Yeah, the little ones.
Yeah.
Already.
And
You know-
even in the Tibetan schools, you teach them from like 3rd, 4th grade.
So does like the way they debate changes throughout the level of contemplation?
The rules remain the same. The topic changes, it becomes more sophisticated, complicated. So you start with something simple as a color and shape as kids or as beginners, and then you move on to isolates, meaning, generality, and all these things later on.
And so the
Tariq definitions.
Kabir.
so just to understand like the intention and the effect of logic and debate in lived experience, like how I'm understanding it as of now, it seems like it clarifies our perceptions, basically how we see reality to be as close to seeing it as it is. Would that be the intention?
Yes, exactly. There is more clarity, there is more fluidity of thought if you train in debate. Fluidity of thought, fluency of thought itself.
단다 세그룹 뭐지 라야 돼 인지 돈 라고.
네, 인지랑.
근데 콘들라 야가 있어. 가서네 벽에 구멍에 벽에장 신장
Kamarudis.
너무 보고라. 다 인지길 라브시나 처음다.
Maybe the
인지기
Sergong program is the most effective program for you, because otherwise you have to spend a lot of years studying Tibetan. So in the Sergong program, they teach in English, and the teacher is amazing. Yeah, he himself trained for like 10-15 years in debate.
And he debates everything. You can never.
And it's not really a class. The class itself is a debate.
Hold every position perfectly.
only talks in debate.
And it's like, it also is kind of, how do I say? Okay, it's tough to, but like with these analytical meditations, which it becomes like an embodied understanding, like it's like vipassana, but not like,
What do you mean by vipassana?
yeah, not,
Like the Goenka vipassana?
that is the reference I have, but basically, if I'm to understand our lived experience in terms of our emotions, our sensations, will this kind of logic and debate help
Now,
in these?
from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, that is what we call mindfulness meditation. That doesn't really constitute a vipassana meditation. Vipassana in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition refers to special insight. So Insight, special insight refers to the wisdom of emptiness. So vipassana in the Tibetan context, Tibetan Buddhist traditional context refers to not just being mindful of sensations, feelings, emotions, and so forth.
Okay. It's more like piercing through
Yes.
into the nature of it.
Yes. Ne nganzo tanda wanzo jaga gilu la goenga la ne lama jera. Ko yu vipassana gitene kan ro mabu jera. Tena la ne vipassana lhagdong la de zamba temba nyesha gi gom jera. Ti lhagdong gi gom mi ba do ji la gunzi chigda. Nganzo pejin nande na lhagdong gom la na di temba nyesha gi gom do tor ma do lhagdong gom la to gi mari la ba. Lhagdong gom la de zamba tendam gi rangshin la chue gi tongni ra ti gom de arans.
Like ultimately deepens our understanding into emptiness.
That's exactly what vipassana is in Tibetan Buddhist tradition.
Is it, I asked this to Dharmadhatu as well, but I was wondering your opinion on it. Is it, how much knowledge one needs from the Dharma to practice kind of like debate?
Dharma.
Yeah, like study, do you have to have like
It's a whole different game if you think about it. You have to work yourself with the definitions first. Without the definitions, there's nothing really to debate about first. So your debate is always working with the definitions.
I see. It's different ballgame.
Yeah, different ballgame, totally. Tanda nganzogi
Definition.
tsingil mena tsoja desa jiwa mara samzi she mara because it's not a matter of debating opinion. It's debating about facts.
Lonze mambu che ora ne.
A lot of memorization.
Penna tanda ngaz dire tari dira. Tile tsini da yawa da mambu thanga mambu singure. Tine jung chembu na jung gi tsawa. Pashin na omai na nze na doi na tsawa sing.
So it starts with something simple like mind and awareness, how each different type of cognition is defined, how each of these mental factors are defined, and then you memorize these definitions, and then begin to debate on your understanding of these definitions, and then slowly you have to be able to memorize whole verses from texts to effectively debate about what exactly is the intended meaning of these verses.
Also, like when you were talking about the pot and investigating the nature of the pot, and then that gets turned around onto the investigation of yourself. Yeah, I had the question like, what is the difference between the self and the pot? And yeah, is that like something that we could kind of go into a bit, like in terms of because the way the debate goes is quite interesting.
Ta tanda nganzo gi phumba pela shane ni phumba gi rangshin la cheba chiyor la nganzo ta tsoba tsu de zamba phumba mida ba rangshin ba tsoba tsu ya ra tinde yong ge res ani nganzo gi ta suzu gi khansa nga yin la thela ya tha na shin gi cheba rimshin ro re song ras cheza ani phumba la cheba da ani suzu gi khansa gi da la jura tela ani cheba de la cheba khare yo res ra cheda
Kasa ki da yimi da.
phumba yu me la jura tela cheba ki rimba de la ni tsini ngone ma cheba chen de zamba cheba do es
Pumba yimi cheba da. Ra. Pumba yimi cheba da kasa ki da yimi cheba. Ra. Kasa ki da de yo ta yo ma ta me bu du ra. Pumba roji na me ba tani na yo bu du. Pumba yo ra. Me pumba yo ma ra sin jela yo re la ra. Chitangi pumba sin di yo ngo ka na to de shi ji tu shin ba la de pumba pandra de do ra. Tena da yimi la di ra. Chitangi ngi gi ngaran tsala fa chaga da na ani pa ma tenjo lu chi na pa gi la ra shi rang ne ra shi gi tsu ba ji de me da. Chitangi ya tunda ba zu na sha da ma bo ya da ra. Tunda yo
konzo ma di tsini jangna mangche do di luk de ra da chirama lu de
do de ba da.
do de ba da chirama lu de. So now it is important to understand that we cannot immediately begin to look at logic and debate and equate it with the sophisticated, more complex assertions of the Madhyamika Prasangika school. because when you train in debate, you are actually training in debate within the framework of the assertions of the first two schools actually, the Vibhashika school and the Sutantrika school. So it's a little bit difficult to immediately make that jump, even when you are debating. So now, when we are talking about the difference between investigating the pot and the self, then one of the most distinct kind of difference lies in the fact that when we think of pot, the referent object of the term called pot is something that you can point to. Not pinpoint, but at least point to. Yes. So we leave conventionality, the extent of conventionality, for the sake of debate, to that first. But when you look at the referent object of the self, then maybe that object is a little bit difficult to pinpoint to. Did you have a question?
Yeah, when like Geshema it's very natural for students to have preference for one teacher over the other, right? So that sort of attachment kind of builds up. So how did she navigate through it, and like if she could share her story?
The koi dila yadu Geshema nima tsuma lo chunjung yindi zamba ane nyongwa dende do chung ses gigenchi la soso gawa yijo do ya. Ane gigenchi la shen le la gawa yijo. Dende chung ses ra. Dende chung na ane Geshema chirangi donglen khande chings.
Gege laptang la ora, labdigala.
The way he teaches, the way a teacher teaches, or
Yeah, like it starts with how they are like in classroom, but then you are also liking them as a person itself. You they're so nice and sweet. It happens.
Mi shiga jambo yujo, lapti chidi zamba lapti yapo chinye, dende la susu dis shimbala ne kalor chaba shukchea yujo do, ga che yungo do as. Dende Geshema chirang la nyongwa chuyen na di donglen khande chings.
Gege kaje da sosola nga chibo mara gege gerula shasa yimida. Korang ingune tani kalejan shinyagi chidi pe bezo ya uchina. Geru samadila gagdo gege di kale jawara. Tsinyi da labe lelhabo mara ra. Tila tagore pe shimba tagore chadi yapo chini ani nganzola pe ra yapo china. Genge dila rashi gilo ta nyimbo kushe legidu gendila khalota. Pe gendi une yapo chigido samegi tsolegida. Ta gege kashi chitande machi yapora ya kashi malabe chadi shira masu. Ra ani labdi gala pagin zegan leda taka tisu kanshi rojis dedi gala antis nyuda. Ta khala nga zu pe nusa tarimbo dinis lere nga zu labjun chaga lere. Ta yamala digim dena ande genge de nyunyure. Mingi mitsira chitang genge nishu sumji tenyude chingiye deni chumani ra genge tsama pe yapora. Ani kon sama sensu chimbo nganzola lapja bo di special laba chibo marando tang de tang sa tang kharin tsama la wora tinde gi tanda ngema da yimba gela ga yimba nganzo phama do nare pheba gi la shutsu wora ra gi se de so to mola eta nu mar tinde gi nganzo tsono chimbo tinde indi gala ani tidi gala gi jidro nganzo pe mi chitang gi de pe ta nganzo palasina amalasina kharisana khorara ra.
So now, in my own experience, I have had about 20 to 30 teachers, and none of them really, when I look at the manner in which we develop respect for our teachers, then it comes from an appreciation for the effort that they put into teaching us. And when that effort is very clear, then students naturally have a sense of affection for the teacher, respect for the teacher. So it comes more from a place of respect for the effort that they are putting. And in my experience, it might be the case that you also have this experience, that if a teacher, the effort of the teacher is very evident, then immediately you become appreciative of their work, of their teaching. Then similarly, the Buddhist texts, they're not easy to teach actually. More particularly things like philosophy, logic and debate. It is very hard to immediately impart a correct understanding. It takes a lot of preparation, a lot of effort. And as such, we as students appreciate that effort. And as such, we have respect and affection for our teachers. And in my experience, or I never met a teacher who didn't put in that effort. I had about 20 to 30 teachers, and all of them put in the effort to try to impart a true and correct understanding of the teachings, texts to us. And now, when in the Tibetan culture, especially in the Tibetan Buddhist culture, a teacher is no less than a parent too, because we come from far away, leaving everything behind. So as such, a teacher appreciates this fact that not only is it their responsibility to teach in the classroom, but also to offer counseling, guidance with regards to how to conduct oneself. And as such, it's a very intimate and respectful relationship. Geshema is maybe of an older generation than me, so I know that when we were young, we also had the same kind of respect. We were fearful of looking directly into the eyes of our teacher. That's the kind of esteem or respect to which we hold our teacher. But we grew up, generations change. We became more direct later on. But with Geshema's generation, this is extremely true.
Oh, but still in
Yeah.
the Tibetan nunnery.
Yeah, in the nunneries, yeah, that's.
In the nunnery, it's wow, it's very clear.
You're not supposed to look into.
Not supposed to. It's just a natural expression of respect. Otherwise, in this day and age, relationships, interactions can be really confrontational in their nature. So we never had that with our teachers. And in the monastic institutions, I think it's much more than that.
sibu gingi sibuda nyepto de ina ngaze pe inten zamdo nyale gora ani chizo mambo zeta chogore ani nyepto ina gingi sisa sanga no che an kashi pe ngana hi jogo sheda shedan de yago sheda ngala ani danda ina thigide gende ndele yodo ani ngaze ge migi chi phalla gona gengi sidi peche tan gende thigida ra tinere de only kadi thigide kadi chimura gende.
So now with that being said, then of course there are some teachers we remember more than the others because the manner in which they kind of teach the classroom in a very breezy manner, try to break the monotonous discussion with stories, examples and so forth. And now when we hear this kind of sayings, examples in this day, then we immediately feel as if that teacher is right in front of us. So we break the tea here at this point.